You better start earning your keep." That was the very first thing my stepdad screamed directly into my face while I was lying in a hospital bed, fresh from emergency surgery. My body was still completely numb from the anesthesia, my legs were barely able to move, and every small breath felt like a sharp blade pulling at my stitches. I tried to speak through the haze, telling him quietly that I physically couldn't work yet, it was strict doctor's orders. 2 weeks, I whispered. Then, his heavy hand came swinging down. The entire world tipped sideways in an instant. Cold, sterile hospital tiles kissed my cheek as my head cracked against the floor. Warm blood immediately flooded my mouth, spilling over my lips. My hands trembled violently against the linoleum as he stood over my crumpled body and snarled, "Stop pretending you're weak." When the nurses and police officers rushed into the room a moment later, everyone stared at him in absolute horror. But what none of those horrified onlookers knew at the time was that this violent outburst wasn't the worst thing he had done to us. The real, catastrophic betrayal had started long before that slap in the hospital room. My name is Emma. I'm in my late 20s, and before that bright hospital bed became the terrifying center of my world, I lived a quiet, exhausting life. I worked retail during the day, standing on my feet for 8 hours, and took on every creative freelance design project I could find at night. It wasn't glamorous work, and it certainly didn't make me rich, but it paid some of the mounting bills. More importantly, it kept the electricity on and the water running in the house my real dad had left behind for us. My biological dad had passed away after a long, grueling illness, the painful, slow kind that drains a family's life savings quietly, invoice by invoice, until you are simply too exhausted to argue with the bank numbers anymore. After his funeral, our family home felt hollow and massive. His favorite winter jacket still hung quietly on the coat rack by the front door. His worn ceramic coffee mug sat untouched in the drying rack beside the sink. My mom tried her absolute best to stay strong for me, but I could watch the sheer weight of grief and financial anxiety bend her shoulders a little lower with every passing month. That was precisely when my stepdad entered our lives. He showed up acting exceedingly polite, helpful, and supremely confident. He was the exact kind of man who spoke in immediate solutions instead of hollow sympathy. He told my grieving mother that he could help organize our messy debt payments. He promised he would take care of everything so my mom could finally rest her tired mind. 6 short months later, they were married. I distinctly remember standing in our living room right after the small ceremony, watching him carry heavy boxes into the master bedroom like he had always owned the place. At first, nothing felt blatantly wrong. But slowly, imperceptibly, small things started to shift around the house. The monthly utility and mortgage bills completely stopped coming to the kitchen table. Payments were mysteriously handled behind closed doors. My mom stopped checking her personal bank accounts because he repeatedly convinced her that she simply didn't need to stress herself over numbers anymore. Whenever I asked specific questions about the house title or monthly expenses, I was brushed off and told not to worry. When I pushed harder for transparency, I was subtly guilt-tripped and reminded how incredibly lucky we were to have a strong man willing to take charge of our chaotic lives. Then, my mom began to change. She started getting unusually tired, and then deeply forgetful. She would lose her train of thought mid-sentence, staring blankly at the kitchen stove like she couldn't remember why she had turned the burner on in the first place. My stepdad casually brushed it off as late-onset stress and aging. Every single morning, he would hand her a carefully selected group of vitamins lined up neatly on the granite counter, standing over her and watching intently until she swallowed every last pill. I kept my head down and kept working. I even paid rent out of my meager retail paychecks to stay in my own childhood bedroom, telling myself that this was just adulthood, compromise, and family duty. Then, my appendix unexpectedly ruptured. The agony came fast and vicious, folding me completely in half on the cold bathroom floor in the middle of the night. Emergency surgery followed immediately. When I finally woke up in the recovery ward, my body felt as though it had been violently rearranged without my consent. The head surgeon sat beside my bed and explicitly told me that I needed critical rest, 2 full weeks of absolute bed rest, no heavy lifting, and absolutely no work. That was the exact medical directive I explained to my stepdad when he walked into my hospital room. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't argue with him, and I didn't try to be difficult, I just explained my physical reality. "I can't work yet," I said softly. He looked down at me like I had personally insulted his honor. I didn't know it then, but that was the exact moment everything irrevocably shifted. It was the precise second I stopped being a compliant family member to him and became an inconvenient financial problem. And once I became a problem, he completely stopped pretending to care. The hospital room was far too bright for that early in the morning. White walls, white cotton sheets, and the steady, rhythmic beep of an electronic monitor made time feel uncomfortably thick and slow. I remember staring up at the acoustic ceiling tiles, meticulously counting the small, dark cracks to distract my mind from the sharp, pulling pain in my lower abdomen every time my lungs expanded. That was when the heavy door swung open and he walked in. There was no gentle greeting, no ask about my pain levels, and no fatherly concern. There was only the sharp, final sound of the heavy door clicking shut behind him and the cold reflection of his face in the stainless steel cabinet across from my bed. His jaw was clenched tight, his broad shoulders were squared, and he possessed the rigid posture of a man who had already decided he was entirely in the right before the conversation had even begun. He started barking about money before he even reached the edge of my bed. He rambled on about overdue bills, missed household payments, how expenses were rapidly backing up because of my hospital stay, and how I urgently needed to pull my weight. I swallowed hard, trying my best to keep my trembling voice steady as I answered him. I repeated what the surgical team had instructed. The doctor said I physically could not return to work yet. 2 weeks of rest, maybe slightly less if the incision healed cleanly without infection. He laughed. It wasn't a loud laugh, but a quiet, cruel chuckle that stung worse than an insult. That was the exact moment he uttered the line that still echoes in my mind whenever the house grows too quiet at night: "You better start earning your keep." I remember blinking in pure disbelief, genuinely convinced my brain was playing tricks on me because of the heavy pain medication. I was hooked up to heart monitors. My 4-bag dripped saline steadily right beside my head. I hadn't even been cleared to stand up on my own 2 feet yet. I repeated myself, my voice dropping softer this time out of pure fear. I told him I physically could not stand up for an 8-hour retail shift. His entire expression changed. It wasn't an explosive outburst of rage, it was something far colder, calculated, and controlled. It was as if something dark inside him had finally clicked into place. He leaned down over my rail, lowered his voice to a dangerous whisper, and told me I was just pretending. He said I was being dramatic. He said I was lazy. He said I was weak. And then his hand flew across the bed and struck my face. I never saw the blow coming. 1 second I was resting back against the white pillows, and the very next second my entire upper body was sliding sideways, getting violently tangled in the sheets before crashing heavily onto the hard floor. The sheer force of the impact completely knocked the wind out of my lungs. The freezing floor tiles pressed violently against my swollen cheek. I tasted hot, metallic blood as my lips split open against my teeth. My hands shook uncontrollably as I tried to push my upper body off the ground, not out of physical weakness, but out of sheer, unadulterated shock. He stood directly over my fallen body, spat on the floor, and barked, "Stop pretending you're weak." That was the exact moment the room instantly filled with chaotic noise. Heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway, frantic shouting called for hospital security, and nurses rushed through the door with wide eyes and hands already reaching out to protect me. I remember one nurse immediately kneeling down on the blood-spotted tiles beside me, pressing a cool towel to my face and telling me softly not to move, her voice shaking with a fierce anger she was trying desperately to contain for my sake. And then the police officers arrived. They took one look at me lying helpless on the floor, at the dark blood smeared across my white hospital gown, at the 4-pole that had been knocked over beside the bed, and the entire atmosphere shifted. My stepdad immediately started talking fast, gesturing wildly, and smiling in that thin, slippery, overly polite way he always used whenever things didn't go his way. I lay there on the cold floor listening to his smooth lies, staring up at the flickering fluorescent ceiling lights, and felt something deep inside my soul harden into solid steel. That violent slap wasn't just a sudden loss of temper, it was an absolute declaration of war. And for the very first time in my life, I understood with crystal clarity exactly who and what he really was. I was discharged from the hospital a day later than original plans dictated, not because my surgical incision had reopened, but because every doctor and nurse suddenly moved much slower and more cautiously around me, as if they were terrified I might physically shatter if they breathed too hard in my direction. As I was being wheeled toward the exit, a compassionate nurse discreetly slipped a small, folded business card into my discharge paperwork while my stepdad was standing at the front desk, loudly arguing with the receptionist about parking validation fees. The nurse didn't say a single word, she simply caught my terrified eyes and gave me the smallest, most knowing nod. I didn't dare pull the card out to read it until late that night. Returning home felt intensely surreal. The house felt fundamentally different than before, quieter, smaller, and suffocatingly dark. My mom hovered around my armchair like a ghost who was afraid to touch solid ground, her trembling hands always half-raised toward me before dropping uselessly back to her sides. She kept forgetting where she had placed her reading glasses, kept forgetting what day of the week it was, and repeatedly apologized for everything, for the volume of the TV, for the ambient light in the room, and for her very existence. My stepdad acted as if the hospital incident had never even occurred. He cooked elaborate family dinners, told loud jokes, and recounted a long story about highway traffic, laughing heartily at his own punchlines. Whenever my mom took a second too long to answer a basic question, he smoothly finished her sentences for her with an air of saintly patience. Whenever she winced from a sudden headache, he handed her the exact same unlabeled vitamins he always forced on her, lined up neatly on the granite counter like dutiful little soldiers. I sat quietly in the corner and watched. The heavy pain medications blurred the physical aches in my abdomen, but they strangely sharpened my mental focus. I began picking up on subtle patterns, precise timing, and alarming correlations, the specific way my mom's severe mental confusion spiked dramatically after certain meals, the way legal documents and banking statements mysteriously vanished the moment I asked to see them, and the rent payments I knew I had personally made that somehow didn't exist in his official ledger. Late that night, after ensuring the hallway was dead silent, I pulled out the folded card the nurse had given me. It contained a simple website URL for an organization specializing in domestic coercive control. I sat under my blankets and read the digital articles until my eyes burned in the dark. Financial exploitation. Medical gaslighting. Systematic isolation. The clinical words on the screen felt uncomfortably intimate. It was like reading a detailed, step-by-step diagnostic manual created specifically about our household. A few days later, our longtime neighbor knocked on the back door holding a warm pot of homemade soup. She stood in the kitchen and quietly watched my mom shuffle past the doorway like a confused shell of her former self. The neighbor leaned in close to me and whispered that something was deeply wrong. She revealed that her adult daughter worked in specialized geriatric healthcare and had noticed the strange, unlabeled pill bottles around our house, the improper dosages, and the terrifyingly rapid pace of my mom's cognitive decline. That very night, while everyone was asleep, I decided to enter the back room my stepdad always kept strictly locked. The physical lock on the interior door was cheap and flimsy, the secret contents inside the room were not. Inside his private desk, thick manila folders were stacked with terrifying precision, meticulously labeled with official corporate terms like insurance policies, asset transfers, and survivorship benefits. I didn't need to read through every single page to understand the big picture. One document was enough, then another, then another. There were massive life insurance policies taken out exclusively in my mother's name, astronomical payout amounts with effective dates that lined up far too perfectly with the exact month her health had begun to mysteriously deteriorate. My hand shook violently against the cold wood of the desk, but my mind was suddenly overwhelmingly clear. This wasn't chaotic household mismanagement or unfortunate bad luck. This was a slow, deliberate, cold-blooded execution plan. I carefully placed every single document back into its exact original position. I crept back to my bedroom and lay under the sheets, staring up at the dark ceiling until the sun began to rise. Fear pressed terribly heavy on my chest, but directly beneath that fear was something entirely new, absolute, unshakable focus. I completely stopped confronting him. I stopped asking probing questions about our family finances. I let him believe that the hospital slap had successfully broken my spirit. While he walked around the house relaxed, smugly convinced that he had completely conquered me, I quietly began assembling the trap that would destroy him. Once you truly see a toxic pattern, it is physically impossible to unsee it. I spent the next several days replaying our entire family history in my head like high-definition security footage on a continuous loop. I analyzed the precise timing of my mom's worst days, noting how her hands trembled significantly more after breakfast than after dinner, and how he constantly hovered over her while she took those daily vitamins, watching her throat muscles with intense concentration until she swallowed every last pill. I completely detached myself emotionally. I stopped thinking of this as my tragic life and started approaching it like a high-stakes criminal investigation. The emotional distance gave me absolute operational clarity. The very first tactical decision I made was to stop reacting to his provocation. I didn't utter a word of protest when he arrogantly talked over my mother during dinner. I didn't flinch or look away when he snapped at me for moving too slowly around the kitchen. I simply nodded obediently, kept my eyes down, and stayed quiet. I intentionally moved with exaggerated slowness, making him believe I was still physically fragile and emotionally shattered from the surgery. He thoroughly enjoyed that version of me. He mistook my tactical silence for absolute surrender. Behind his back, I began systematically connecting the dots. Late at night, using private browsing windows, I began searching his full legal name, past addresses, and public court records across multiple states. It didn't take long to find the trail of destruction he had left in his wake. I discovered a previous woman, then a second, and then a third. They were scattered across different states, but every single story shared the exact same terrifying blueprint: rapid romantic relationships, complete takeover of shared family finances, sudden unexplained medical illnesses in the female partners, and horrific, financially devastating separations. I gathered my courage and sent one careful, neutral message to his most recent ex-wife. I offered no dramatic accusations or emotional rants. I simply asked a polite, specific question regarding his past financial management habits. Her devastating reply came back less than an hour later: "Is he doing it to you, too?" That single sentence was the exact moment I realized with absolute certainty that I wasn't being paranoid. We ended up speaking on the phone for hours. She eventually added me to a private, highly secure online group comprised entirely of women who had all survived different variations of my stepdad's calculated cruelty. They didn't speak with dramatic anger, they communicated strictly with hard facts, bank statements, court dates, and medical records. Their documented experiences were so terrifyingly identical to what was happening under our roof that it made my stomach violently turn. One woman in the group worked directly in legal support, another had kept exhaustive archives of every bounced check, forged signature, and threatening email he had ever sent her. They didn't tell me what to do, they simply gave me the tools and showed me that I was no longer alone in the dark. The next critical piece of evidence came from right down our street. Our neighbor's daughter stopped by our house one afternoon under the friendly guise of bringing over fresh baked goods for my mom. She sat quietly in the kitchen, carefully observing out of the corner of her eye as my stepdad prepared a morning smoothie for my mom, mixing in a fine white powder from an unmarked plastic container. Later that evening, when my stepdad briefly left the house to run an errand, the daughter pulled me aside into the hallway. She told me softly that while she couldn't make an official medical diagnosis without formal blood panel testing, the physical symptoms my mother was displaying, the severe tremors, the extreme memory lapses, the sudden lethargy, were classic clinical indicators of long-term chemical sedation and toxicity. "The specific combination of what he's giving her explains absolutely everything," she whispered urgently. That expert observation was all the confirmation I needed. I immediately began keeping a detailed, time-stamped digital log of every single conversation, household schedule, meal preparation routine, and financial demand he made. I didn't bother touching his locked office files again. I didn't need to. He had grown arrogant, careless, and supremely confident in his absolute control over us. He routinely took loud business calls in the living room, casually discussing offshore accounts and liquidating assets, completely assuming that neither my memory-fogged mother nor his broken stepdaughter was intelligent enough to understand what he was saying. Then, he finally made his ultimate power move. He came home one Tuesday evening carrying a thick leather folder tucked under his arm. Strutting into the kitchen with the triumphant smile of a man who believed he had officially crossed the finish line. He casually laid the documents out on the dining table in front of my mom, claiming it was just standard administrative paperwork that our family lawyer had strongly recommended she sign. It was a complete power of attorney transfer, a document that would give him absolute, unchecked legal control over all of her remaining property, bank accounts, and medical decisions. My mom's trembling hand reached weakly for the pen, her fogged eyes staring blankly at the signature line. I felt a surge of adrenaline burst inside my chest, but I forced my breathing to stay completely steady. I stepped forward, looked him dead in the eye, and asked a simple, unassuming question: since this is such an important legal document, shouldn't we have a neutral third-party notary or legal representative present in the room? Just to make sure everything is completely official and legally binding? He hesitated for a fraction of a second, his eyes narrowing as he evaluated me. But seeing only a timid, meek girl standing before him, his massive ego won out. He chuckled condescendingly and agreed, stating we would schedule a formal signing for the following week. That single week was all the time I needed to execute my plan. The surviving women from his past helped me understand precisely which evidence held absolute legal weight in a court of law and which details crossed into severe criminal territory. I quietly reached out to local law enforcement, adult protective services, and forensic financial investigators. I didn't exaggerate my story, and I didn't shed a single emotional tear. I simply presented the cold, hard facts, showed them the time-stamped digital logs, and provided the contact information of his previous victims. The authorities listened with intense, unyielding focus. The trap was set. The plan came together with terrifying speed. A few days later, he arrogantly announced to the house that he would be out late attending his weekly community league meeting, an event he proudly never missed. He left the house completely relaxed, whistling a tune, casually counting future money that wasn't his yet. He even put on a grand performance of kissing my frail mother on the forehead before strolling out the front door. I watched his car pull out of the driveway and felt nothing but cold, absolute resolve. Exactly 30 minutes after his departure, our front doorbell rang. Then it rang a second time. Within seconds, our house was filled with calm, authoritative professionals, police officers, adult protective agents, and a specialized medical team. Gentle female paramedics guided my mother into a warm coat, speaking to her with immense kindness while asking her direct questions about her health. For the first time in over 2 years, without his menacing presence looming over her shoulder, my mom began answering their questions with astonishing clarity. Investigative teams systematically moved through the house with search warrants, collecting marked evidence, securing the unlabeled chemical containers in the kitchen, and packing his locked office files into secure boxes. Everything was conducted entirely by the book, no chaotic shouting, no dramatic scenes, just methodical, unstoppable justice. Simultaneously, across town at the community center, 2 plainclothes detectives approached my stepdad in the middle of his meeting and tapped him firmly on the shoulder. I wasn't physically present in that room, but the lead detective described the scene to me later with immense satisfaction. He told me how my stepdad initially laughed loudly, assuming it was all an absurd mistake, how he aggressively tried to talk his way out of it using his usual polished charm, how his face completely drained of color as the detective slowly read off the long list of criminal charges, and how the entire room fell dead silent as heavy steel handcuffs clicked tightly around his wrists. The very community members he had been proudly boasting to just hours earlier backed away in disgust, horrified to realize the monster that had been walking among them. When the police cruisers brought him back to our house later that night to execute the final property search, the game was already completely over. He was led through the front door in handcuffs and forced to witness the reality of his total collapse. He saw my mother sitting completely safe on the living room couch, wrapped in a warm blanket, drinking hot tea and speaking to protective agents with a lucid clarity he thought he had permanently destroyed. He saw state investigators carrying heavy boxes of forged financial documents out of his private office. And finally, he saw me standing steadily in the center of the hallway, standing tall, completely unbothered, with not a single trace of fear left in my eyes. For the very first time since I had met him, the terrifying man looked pathetically small. He desperately tried to speak to me as he passed, his voice shaking as he attempted to bargain and manipulate one last time. He pleaded that I had completely misunderstood his intentions, that everything he did was purely to help our family, and that real families always handle their private problems internally. I didn't raise my voice, and I didn't display a single shred of anger. I simply looked down at him and said, "The truth doesn't need your protection anymore." As the officers firmly guided him out the front door and into the back of the police cruiser, he turned his head to look at me one final time, his eyes wide with pure, unadulterated panic. The cruel man who had once stood over my bleeding body in a bright hospital bed and screamed at me to stop pretending to be weak couldn't find a single word left to say. The legal aftermath moved with swift, uncompromising speed. Comprehensive toxicology testing on my mother officially confirmed our worst suspicions. The vitamins he had been forcing her to ingest every morning contained high doses of prescription sedatives specifically designed to induce severe cognitive impairment and artificial dementia over time. Forensic financial audits quickly uncovered millions of dollars in attempted fraud, stolen inheritances, and illegal offshore accounts that I hadn't even known existed. As news of his arrest broke locally, even more victims courageously came forward to tell their stories. The overwhelming mountain of physical evidence stacked up so high that his defense attorneys couldn't find a single shred of plausible deniability. Every single desperate attempt he made to manipulate the legal system completely collapsed under the sheer weight of documented facts. My mom stayed in a specialized medical care facility for 2 weeks of intensive observation and detox. Within just a few days of being completely freed from his daily chemical poisoning, the thick fog in her brain completely lifted. Healthy color rapidly returned to her pale face. She wept hysterically when the full reality of what he had been doing to her finally sank in, and then she wept even harder when she realized that the nightmare was officially over forever. When we finally returned home together, the house felt fundamentally transformed. It wasn't empty or quiet in a terrifying way anymore. It felt light, clean, and genuinely peaceful. Windows were thrown wide open to let the fresh breeze circulate through the rooms. Furniture stayed where we wanted it. Utility bills and financial ledgers were laid out openly on the dining table, no longer hidden in locked rooms, and no longer mysterious. Managing our lives was undeniably overwhelming at times, but it was completely honest. The legal proceedings moved forward smoothly without any unnecessary drama. The hard evidence did all the heavy lifting in court. My stepdad was ultimately sentenced to decades in federal prison without the possibility of early parole. Accountability had finally arrived, not loudly or theatrically, but with absolute, unyielding firmness. I gradually returned to my life, starting work again with a completely new set of personal priorities. I reduced my retail hours and began devoting my free time to volunteering with local domestic violence organizations, training staff to recognize the subtle, deadly signs of financial exploitation and medical coercive control that our society so frequently misses. I didn't do it because I viewed myself as some fearless hero, but because I knew intimately how terrifyingly lonely that silence feels when you are trapped inside it. One warm evening last week, my mom hung a new framed photograph in the main hallway right by the front door. It was a simple, beautiful picture of just the two of us smiling broadly on a sunny afternoon, no fake performances, no hidden secrets, and no dark shadows lurking in the background. For the very first time in my entire life, the future felt wonderfully, beautifully quiet. I am sharing this painful story with you today because family betrayal rarely looks openly monstrous at the beginning. Most of the time, it wears a polite smile, offers unsolicited help, and sounds like protective care wrapped tightly in fake concern. And sometimes, it takes just one single, terrifying moment of absolute clarity to change the entire trajectory of your life. If any part of this story felt uncomfortably familiar to what you are currently living through, please know in your heart that you are not alone, and it is never too late to draw a line in the sand. If you have ever had to fiercely protect yourself or someone you love from the toxic people closest to you, please share your story in the comments below. And don't forget to hit subscribe so you never miss the next story.